been playing rapid and blitz games 3 days prior to the event to prepare for it. So they both know each other extremely well. Vladimir Kramnik with the wide pieces, of course, is a very strong serve. And it's going to be interesting to see if Magnus Carlsen tries to avoid theory. We've seen him play a bunch of very goofy openings the first couple of rounds with d5 and a6, or if against Kramnik he goes for a main line and discusses opening knowledge there. Vladimir Kramnik looks very relaxed. He's been on the stage. He's a former world champion. He's not going to be too scared. But, of course, for him, playing against Magnus Carlsen is always a big challenge. There he salutes the leader, Maxim Graf. A couple of years ago in the media, it looked like there was a bit of controversy between Kramnik and Carlsen. They were taking some jabs at each other back and forth. But now, if they're training together, it looks like their relationship is in very good shape. And let's hope this game in the first round does not change that. Or maybe let's hope it does, so we get some more action in the media. Leinier Dominguez from Cuba there in the white shirt. Also a former World Blitz champion, but I've mentioned this yesterday. He won the last event that was held with a time control of 5-0, meaning the players did not get bonus seconds after every move. In this tournament, they play with 3 minutes per game and 2 seconds per move, which sounds more than 5-0, but I've heard a lot of players talking about that it's really not a lot of time, and they're so used to playing with 5 minutes that this 3 minutes plus 2 seconds has been a very challenging format, especially for the older guys who are more used to 5-0 games, and we shall see who adapts to it the best. Magnus Carlsen so far has seemed comfortable at pretty much every time control. He's won the rapid very confidently, starting with 10 out of 12, and then petering out with 3 draws. Won that 1 point ahead of another big favorite, Jan Nepomniachtchi, who's not been doing very well in the Blitz. If I read correctly, he lost something like 96 rating points on day 1 alone. So Jan Nepomniachtchi missing on the stage, but a lot of big names are there, and it looks like we're getting started. Klaus Deventer is opening the round. Here we go. Let's keep our eyes on the Kramnik-Carlsen matchup. Vladimir Kramnik with the white pieces goes for 1 knight f3 to g3. This is not a way to avoid theory. This is what he's been doing over the last couple of years. He's specializing in this. And the setup with d5 and g6 was played by Vishy Anand himself in the World Championship against Magnus Carlsen. So both players should be very familiar with this. c4, c6 and queen to a4 is a rare move, probably meant to get Carlsen out of book. Knight to d7, c takes d5, c takes d5. Of course, queen a4 looks a little funny, but the knight is also slightly misplaced on d7. Black would much rather have it on c6, so that's the idea of Kramnik by including this queen a4, knight bd7. Now we get a standard position after d4, where black wants his knight on c6, but white also doesn't want his queen on a4. So some small nuances here. Clearly Kramnik has prepared this line. He's playing instantly, and Carlsen's going to have a little think to see what to do. Knight to b6 looks like an obvious move, attacking the queen on a4. Knight to e4 is another option, but then it looks like with the knight on d7, knight takes d5 is possible, unless I'm missing some trick. So I would expect him to go knight to b6, but there's other possibilities. The setup with b6 and bishop to b7 has been played by Fabiano Caruana in similar situations. You could just go for the move e6, reinforcing the center. Magnus Carlsen has a decision here, and he's already spent almost a minute, so he might be slowly getting back into the blitz rhythm. He's played b6 in Caruana style, bishop f4, and Kramnik is slightly better. Magnus Carlsen's going to have to defend here. Rook fc1, a6 is normal to stop knight to b5. Now, yeah, knight to e5 is coming, hinting at ideas with knight to c6. Kramnik has gotten in his preparation. The black position is solid, but slightly worse. White could just go knight c6, trying to grab the 2 bishops, or he could go for a move like... I wasn't going to say that one, but he goes queen b3, keeping an eye on the b6 pawn, and maybe anticipating b5 from black, which would now run into a4. However, Carlsen is solid, goes rook c8, looks like he has everything covered for now. It's up to Kramnik to decide how to continue his queenside offensive. Knight to a4 comes to mind. And b5? Not sure. Bishop g5 could also be an option, because his bishop on f4 looks like it's not doing that much. And Kramnik is taking time for the first time in the game, trying to figure out the nuances. I do believe that he's slightly better, but that doesn't mean much. Magnus Carlsen doesn't need an opening advantage. He just needs a playable position, and it looks like he's gotten that. Kramnik couldn't find anything better than e3, which is a useful move, defending the d4 pawn. That's always a little double-edged in such positions, because after black goes h6, he might be threatening g5. So you're sort of locking the bishop out with e3. And yeah, before h6 comes, Kramnik gets rid of it with bishop to g5. Very sensible decision. He's trying to get in f4, kind of play a stonewall position without his bishop incarcerated on c1. Queen d6. I would expect Kramnik to play f4 here. He takes on f6 first, gets rid of the bishop. Knight takes, and now that e5 is no longer hanging, he attacks the pawn on b6. This could be trouble for Carlsen. b5 is a positional concession, then the knight jumps into c5. And else, how do you defend the b6 pawn? Knight d7, white just goes knight takes d7. Maybe you have some ideas with rook to b8 or rook takes c1 followed by rook b8, but it all looks fairly unpleasant. Knight takes and now goes b5, allowing knight to c5. Rook to c8, and Kramnik is better. You could reinforce that knight on c5, something like queen to a3 followed by b4, or a move like rook c3, threatening knight takes b7, and then to follow up with queen c2, fighting for the c file. It's not pleasant. Yeah, he goes rook c3. Let's see what Carlsen comes up with. If he has to stay passive here, like bishop a8 or rook to c7, he's not going to enjoy himself very much. Queen b6. Just queen c2, I would guess, and yeah, I really dislike black's position. Carlsen also down on the clock. He has 1 minute to Kramnik's 1:45. So the world champion is being put to the test here, and of course, being already half a point behind MVL, a loss would prove costly, and a lot of people would not only catch up with him, but maybe... Can they overtake him? Yeah, I think he's only half a point ahead of Sergei Karyakin and Lenier Dominguez. He's a full point ahead of Vladimir Kramnik. So if Vladimir Kramnik wins this game, he would catch up with Magnus Carlsen. But we're not there yet. Bishop f8, Carlsen doing his best to fight against this dominating knight on c5. And Kramnik has a decision to make. He reinforces it with knight e to d3. But at least one of these krakens have disappeared. The knight on e5 is gone. So Carlsen can't put his bishop on c6. Still struggling. Bishop to f1 looks like an obvious move, reinforcing the pressure against the b5 pawn. But for the moment, the material is equal. Carlsen even has the two bishops, but with such a knight outpost on c5, that really does not mean all that much. However, Kramnik is taking time. Looks like he's not 100% sure what to do. He's now behind on the clock. He plays bishop f1, rook to b8. Can you go knight to b4? He goes back to e5 instead. Now the question is, can Carlsen try to free himself with b takes a4, or does that lose material? Looks like he can. Queen b6, rook b6, and I don't see any tricks. Maybe Magnus Carlsen has survived here. Maybe Vladimir Kramnik missed his b takes a4, and now Carlsen is all right, but I'm not 100% sure yet. You could, yeah, go for some tricks. Knight takes e6, sacrificing a piece, but only temporarily. If f takes e6, knight takes c6, or rook takes c6, wins it back. But the question is if Carlsen can then, let's say, f takes e6. No, he doesn't do it. He seemed unhappy. He banged the table. I was wondering about f e6, knight takes c6, and rook b2, but something must have bothered him. Knight takes f8, and he doesn't take the knight back. He takes on b2 instead, relying on the fact that the knight is trapped on f8. And now he has a dangerous a-pass pawn, so this has become very double-edged. Knight takes h7, a little desperado, taking a pawn before this knight meets its maker. And another trick from Carlsen. Wow, this is too quick for me to see all the action coming. Rook f2, king f2, knight e4 check. Picks up the pawn. The material is equal. Black has two isolated pawns, and a lot will depend if this a-pawn turns out to be an asset or a weakness that can be attacked by the white king. And so far it looks like it's the latter. The king made it to b4, controlling that a-pawn. The pawn on d5 is a little weak as well, so Vladimir Kramnik is better here. Once again, he has one of his favorite, slightly better endgames. However, he has to find a way to convert it, to put pressure. He goes for bishop c6, exchanging bishops in order to pick up the a4 pawn. Carlsen activates his knight with knight e4, trying to go knight to f2, attack on h3. Now it has to be calculated. Knight takes d5, knight takes h3, king takes a4, knight back to f2. Carlsen trying to pick up the g4 pawn. Kramnik goes for a march of his d-pawn, but it looks like black is in time to control that with his king. So I think Kramnik has gone wrong here. He overdid it with his d-pawn advance, and now only Carlsen can be better. Carlsen is a pawn up, the d-pawn is not going to queen, and this g-pawn might very well, if Kramnik doesn't manage to convert his d-pawn. What's going on? King to d8, knight to c5, threatening knight b7, then knight e7 check. Could be like that we're headed for a draw after knight c5. Knight d4 check, king d6, knight b5 or knight f5 with a move repetition. King e5. I'm not sure if this is a winning attempt. Not really. Kramnik just wants to pick up the g5 pawn, and the players agree to a draw. Hard-fought game with, changing initiative all the time. A lot of action, but I think Carlsen can be happy with the result. He was under a lot of pressure to begin with. Draw on that game. Let's see how the other matchup between Lenier Dominguez and our leader Maxime Vachier-Lagrave is going. Can we get the camera on that board? Looks like there's a handshake. The game is over. I unfortunately do not know the result. It did look equalish earlier on.